Welcome to Nobody Told Me. I'm Jan Black.
And I'm Laura Owens. Does college work? That's the question being explored in the new book by education journalist Paul Tough, who's our guest on this episode.
Paul's latest book is called The Years That Matter Most: How College Makes or Breaks Us. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Tell us more about what the book is about and what prompted you to write it.
Sure. So the book explores the intersection of these two big themes in American life. One is higher education, and the other is social mobility. And for a long time, I thought that the relationship between those two things was pretty much settled, that college was the great engine of social mobility in the United States today. But over the last couple of decades, that has changed. And now, for many low-income and first-generation college students, higher education more seems like an obstacle to their social mobility. So that's what the book's about. The reason that I wrote it is that I feel like these questions of how young people get ahead, how young people are able to achieve their dreams, are really central to the health of our democracy and the health of our country. And then as a journalist, it also was this opportunity to talk to lots of young people in this critical age, in sort of late adolescence and early adulthood, who are going through these remarkable changes. So their stories were not only sort of nationally, politically, socially meaningful, but they were also just, emotionally, personally, psychologically meaningful as well.
So do you think that everyone needs to go to college these days?
Well, I don't think everyone needs to go to a four-year liberal arts college, but I do think that without some kind of post-secondary credential, the way that our economy works right now, it is really hard to make a living, to enter the middle class. And so we need some kind of option for everybody. I mean, to my mind, there's really a continuum of college. So, community colleges are pretty different than four-year higher education institutions, but they're not that different. They're really they're places where young people are trying to get the skills that they need in order to make a living. And so I feel like everyone needs a good path after high school, and I think for a lot of people that should be through some kind of college.
Tell us about your own personal experience with college.
I had a bit of a shaky college experience myself. So I dropped out of college twice, and I never went back and got my BA.
And how has that impacted your life, or has it?
Well, it's a good question. I think about it a lot, and I certainly thought about it a lot. So I spent 6 years working on this book, so it was sort of like penance for having dropped out of college without a degree. I spent a lot of time back in school.
Yeah.
And, I feel like my own experience is unique and a little strange, and I haven't quite figured out how it affected my life. But I actually think it made me a little bit more, it made me more sympathetic to people who are skeptical about the importance of college. But I also don't go and say like, well, my example proves you don't need a college degree. I think I got really lucky. It was 30 years ago, so I think the economy was a little bit different, and it was easier to get by without a degree. But I don't necessarily recommend my path to others.
So why did education become so important to you?
It's a great question. And you called me an education journalist, and in many ways, that's certainly true. I've spent more than a decade writing about schools, and now for the last 5 or 6 years about colleges. But really what grabs me is not education itself. It is the process of mobility. It is opportunity. It is how young people succeed. And education is the path that young people, especially young people who are growing up in low-income or working-class families, if they want to get to a different place in life, education is the tool that does that. And so I've just always been drawn to that story, story of people changing their lives, and education has become my focus as a result.
You talked about the fact that you spent 6 years working on the book and traveling to 21 states, and you touched a little bit about the differences between community colleges and the Ivy League schools. But tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, if I have an Ivy League education, do you think that almost guarantees me success, whereas if I only have a community college education, it's going to be a lot tougher road?
Well, so I looked at a lot of economics data from economists, and certainly there is a correlation between the selectivity of the institution that you attend and how many years you attend it, and what your income will be as an adult. But there are no guarantees. There are lots of Ivy League graduates who are not doing well in life, and lots of community college graduates who are doing great. But there is this this trend where the more selective education that you get, the more likely you are to do really well. What matters, especially for community college students, I think community college is a great option for lots of kids. What matters, though, is that you get a degree. And the problem with the way a lot of our community colleges work is that a lot of students go and then don't complete, and that is much less valuable in terms of your future earnings.
So what words of wisdom would you offer to a student, say a high school senior, who has been denied admission at their top choice colleges and is looking at maybe having to do community college for a couple of years? Should they feel discouraged?
No, I think they should look at that as a great opportunity. I mean, the nice thing about community colleges is that they are much less expensive than most four-year institutions. So, we have a problem with community college in this country, which is that we don't spend enough public money on them, and so they don't function as well as they should. They don't give the students as much support as they should. But if you can make community college work for you, and there are lots of great programs and opportunities at different community colleges, it's actually a great deal, to spend 2 years at a community college getting an associate's degree. For some students, if they can get a career-focused associate's degree, that's enough. That can get them set up with the skills that they need to get a good job. But it's also, if you want to get a 4-year degree, spending 2 years at a community college, getting your basics out of the way, and then transferring to a 4-year institution is a really good deal, because it means you can get a degree from that 4-year institution and save half your tuition. It can be, for a lot of kids, a really good option. We need to make it, the public needs to make it a better option by giving more resources to those schools.
So how exactly does that process work? I've always been curious about doing the 2 years at community college and then transferring to another school. Are you guaranteed admission in an undergraduate program and a 4-year program if you sign up with the right community college? I know that's how it works with the UC system in California. Yeah,
it depends where you are. I mean, one of the facts about higher education is that there is no national system, right? So it's different in every state, and in some ways it's different in every community. But more and more states are realizing that there's a problem with transfers from community college to 4-year public universities, and they are working to coordinate those systems better. So check what's going on in your state, any listeners, just to figure out whether it's working well or not working well. It should work a whole lot better, and it's just a question of bureaucracy. But it's certainly possible to make it a very smooth system.
There's a move afoot in some communities to make community college free. I'm wondering what you think the impact of that will be.
I think it's a great idea. I mean, community college is pretty inexpensive, so making it free would not change things a whole lot. I think the problem, the issue with community college is not so much its tuition, though, for some students it's a big deal, and making it free would make it easier to go there. The issue in terms of money and community college is that we're just not giving enough resources to those institutions, and they're not spending enough on their students. Going like most states and most communities spend, anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 per student, or even to $20,000 depending on where you live, per student in high school, right? And in community college, we're spending like $4,000 or $5,000 per student. So here, you're going through school, you graduate from high school, you're going on to a more challenging, more advanced kind of education, and suddenly we, the public, decide, okay, we're going to spend like a fifth as much as we were just spending on the next stage of your education, and so no wonder it's not as high quality. It's not, you don't have the same kind of resources. There's no rhyme or reason to that. It doesn't make any sense. We should be spending the same kind of money on community college as we at least are spending on high school.
Our Nobody Told Me conversation continues in just a minute. Much like our extraordinary guests on Nobody Told Me, many Air Medcare Network members have their own inspiring stories to share.
They never thought the unthinkable would actually happen to them, but when it did, they were relieved to have their Air Medcare Network AMCN membership.
If a medical emergency arises, Air Medcare Network provides members with world-class air transport services to the nearest appropriate hospital with no out-of-pocket expenses.
More and more insurance fails to cover the full cost of a medical emergency. Secure protection and financial peace of mind for your entire household by joining Air Medcare Network today. Memberships cost as low as $65 a year and cover 38 states.
Plus, right now, as a Nobody Told Me listener, you'll get a $10 Visa gift card with a new one-year membership.
Visit airmedcarenetwork.com/nobody and use offer code NOBODY.
Again, for a $10 Visa gift card with a new one-year membership, just visit airmedcarenetwork.com/nobody and use offer code NOBODY.
So what are the differences if you have high school students who are from a low-income family versus those from well-off families? How do the higher-income students end up getting the advantage in terms of getting into these schools? And I think you can tie that into the college admissions scandal as well.
Yeah, so one of the things I think that the college admissions scandal really highlighted for people is that those advantages are all over the place, right? It's not like there's one particular advantage that well-off parents have. It's just all over the place. And so, right, the college admissions scandal was the sort of more insane, ludicrous examples of how wealthy parents are able, in some cases, to literally buy their kids' way into college. More often, it is not illegal. It is a legal process, and it is less egregious, but it's no less striking. So, one way is that they can pay tuition. So a lot of institutions, when they are admitting students, they need to pay attention to who can pay tuition and who can't. They don't have unlimited financial aid budgets, and so if you are sending messages to universities that you can pay full tuition, you are at many institutions much more likely to get in. So that's a really straightforward way. A slightly less straightforward is the impact of standardized admissions tests, the SAT and the ACT, which wealthy parents pay for expensive, high-quality tutoring for their kids to do better on those tests. I spent some time reporting in the book. I write about it with this one great SAT tutor in suburban Washington, D.C., who charges $400 an hour. He's an awesome, unbelievable teacher, but he is helping, to make an unfair system more unfair because the wealthy kids who come to him get these huge advantages. Their SAT and ACT scores went way up. And so, because we put so much emphasis on the SAT and the ACT in college admissions, that gives those kids a huge advantage. So those are the two biggies. There are lots of others. Even in sports, one thing that really struck me was that many colleges, when they recruit athletes, they don't tend to recruit football and basketball players. They tend to recruit squash players and lacrosse players and crew and tennis and golf and all of these sports that are most likely to be played by kids who go to prep schools. And so that is one more pathway that money can help students be admitted.
What is the college application process doing to teenagers? I know my kids are in their 20s and early 30s now, and so it's been some time, but it was so stressful all those years ago. I can only imagine what it's like now.
Yeah, so my kids are 4 and 10, so I haven't experienced it myself yet, but it's
something
not
to look forward to
anymore. Yes, but yes, my impression is that it has only gotten more stressful in the years since your kids went through the process. And so the place where I saw it up close in a few different places, both low income and high income kids. But one of the things that really struck me was being in this tutoring center in Washington, D.C. And so here were these kids who had all these advantages. They were getting their test scores, raised all kinds of ways. And so they had lots of great advantages in terms of getting into the college of their choice. But their lives seemed pretty rough. It really it just did not seem like much fun to be focusing as much of their adolescence as they were on this question of which institution am I going to get into. And that's pressure they put on themselves, but it's also pressure their parents put on them, their schools put on them, their peers put on them. And so I think that at both ends of the income spectrum, both with rich kids and poor kids, college admissions is having a really detrimental effect. The fact that we've made it such a sort of winner-take-all competitive game makes life worse, both for rich kids and poor kids.
So once they get into college, what is the college experience like for students these days, especially with a lot of students starting school at this time of year?
I think it depends a lot on where you go. I mean, it also depends on who you are. One thing that really struck me was that like for especially me as a former college dropout, the actual experience of going to college for most students now, I think is a really positive one.
It's fun.
Can be, yeah, it's a great time of life. If you're going to an institution with lots of resources, there are a ton of opportunities. The reality, though, is that how much money you have, what kind of resources your family brings to you as you enter college makes a big difference for two reasons. One is how much money you have really affects what institution you go to, and if you go to an Ivy League school, you're much more likely to be a well-off student. It's much harder to get into if you're a low-income student. So partly there's the fact that those institutions that have a ton of money and resources to spend on their students, they're mostly educating rich kids, and the institutions like community colleges that are mostly educating low-income students, they have far fewer resources. So that experience of going to school there is less fun, less rewarding. But then there's another factor, which I write about in the book, which is that even these most elite, most selective institutions, they do admit some low-income students, but the experience for those low-income students is hard, not academically so much. They often really thrive academically in those schools, but socially, culturally, because those institutions are so dominated by well-off kids. If you're a poor or even working-class kid and you go to an Ivy League institution or another highly selective institution, you're suddenly surrounded by rich kids. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of kids, especially low-income students, getting into that environment is just jarring and shocking, and it affects a lot of the experience of those 4 years.
How so?
Well, I think it's like any culture shock. So I followed this one young woman named Kiki Gilbert as she grew up in poverty and a pretty chaotic home life, and I followed her through her senior year of high school and then into Princeton. And she was really struck by, she sort of had this idea, I think there's this story that we tell ourselves that these most selective institutions are pretty diverse, that they mm-hmm. go out of their way to admit a lot of low-income students.
Yeah.
And what Kiki found when she was there, and what the data demonstrates, when you look more closely at the economic background of their undergraduate population, is that there were very, very few students like her there. So this economist named Raj Chetty did this amazing analysis where he was able to sort of dissect the student bodies of different institutions. And at Princeton, he found only 2.2% of the student body were from the bottom income quintile, which is where Kiki was from. So she was right. There were not a lot of kids like her around.
Yeah. So what did college end up being like for her?
Well, she's about to start her junior year, so it's not over yet. But it was. I mean, it was a combination, and I talked to lots of low-income kids at these highly selective institutions, and they all said some version of the same thing, that on one level, they felt super lucky. For Kiki, she had spent her whole life feeling like she belonged at a place like Princeton. She was an incredibly academic kid, even in some pretty bad public schools that she was in. And so there's a part of her that just felt like, finally, I get to be in a place, surrounded by lots of other smart, ambitious kids, mm-hmm. Talking about great books. And that part of it was great. But, when she had been in high school, she was always surrounded by people like her. And suddenly she was in a place where kids who had an experience like hers, or even who understood or sympathized with her experience, was really hard to find. And she just found that really jarring. I think it's also the case for kids like that anytime you're experiencing social mobility, whether it's at college or anywhere else, it's jarring on a personal level, right? Because you're changing your sense of your identity, your relationship with your family, your relationship with where you came from. And so for her, that first year had a lot to do with adjusting her relationship with her family and her past. And I think that's a challenge for any 17 or 18-year-old.
How important is mentoring for low-income college students?
It's extremely important. I mean, any sort of positive adult contact, whether you call it mentoring or advising or even just good teaching, that is when low-income students, when I talk to low-income students about what worked for them in college, that's what they would always talk about. It was the one person, whether it was an advisor or a mentor or a professor or even like a coach, who really was the person who connected with them and made them feel welcome and like they belonged in this community. That had a profound impact on on them. So, I think mentoring can play a huge role.
If a low-income student doesn't have access to tutoring for the ACT and the SAT, and say they're a smart person, but they, aren't a good test taker, how much of an impact will the SAT and ACT have on them?
You mean how much impact will their not great test score have on them?
Yes.
Huge impact. I mean, especially for low-income students who are not going to be, they're not going to excite admissions people by, thinking, well, they're going to pay our tuition.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not.
What if they have good grades and they have good extracurriculars outside of these test scores?
It helps. I mean, different institutions will make different sorts of decisions. My sense is that the standardized test scores are of premium importance on the part of most admissions officers, and to my mind, they're given too much importance. I mean, the one thing I will say is that a growing number of institutions are going what they call test optional, which means that students can apply without submitting their ACT or their SAT scores. It's still, a relatively small number of schools, but that I think really makes a difference. I think there are students, both rich and poor, who are, fantastic students whose grades really reflect that, who have a well-rounded, extracurricular life, but who aren't getting the right kind of test scores. It's more often, I think, those students are low income than high income. And it's those kids, I think, who can benefit the most from test optional admissions.
But is the SAT a good predictor of how well a student will do in college, do you think?
There is a lot of data about that, and it is a good predictor. It's not a fantastic predictor, and it's not. I think most important, it's not as good a predictor as high school GPA. So if you're looking at either one of those things alone, your high school GPA is a better predictor of how well you do in college than your SAT score.
Mm-hmm. What do you think are the biggest things that need to change if you could only pick two?
I would say two things for sort of two different parts of the higher education market. So for the very sort of most selective, richest institutions, they just need to change their problem is really admissions, right? So they do a great job once they admit low-income students of giving them a lot of support. But they, like that Raj Chetty data shows, they just admit a very small number of them, and they can change that tomorrow because they've got lots of resources, and they should. The bigger change, I think, that has to come on the level of public higher education, which is where all of us as, voters and citizens can actually have some kind of impact, which is that over the past decade or so, we as a nation have cut our funding for public higher education by 16%, adjusted for inflation, at a moment where all of the signs in the economy are that our young people need more and more higher education. So that is crazy. And public higher education is the thing that really matters. It's great to have kids like Kiki going off to Princeton and getting a fantastic education and rising, above where she started. But public higher education is the thing where most low-income students are being educated, and right now we are just not giving them the resources they need to get the education they deserve.
And what are the post-high school options for students who didn't like high school and didn't get good grades there?
Well, it's harder to figure out, and so I write in the book about a few different kind of interesting options at some community colleges, some alternatives to community college, and so they're out there. But the experiments that I found most promising were tiny. There were 200 students here and 100 students there. And so mostly that is the system that we have to work on the most. It's because those kids, if they don't get some kind of post-secondary credential, they don't need to get a 4-year degree, and they probably don't want one. But if they don't get some kind of post-secondary credential, they are going to have a real struggle in today's economy. But we don't make it easy for them to find a good path through community college. We make them pay to go to community college to get the education that they need, and we're not giving those institutions the resources that they need to help them actually graduate and get the skills that they need to enter the workforce.
What advice would you have for a parent of a high schooler who hasn't been through the admissions process? What resources, if they have any resources to devote to getting their child into college in terms of getting some tutoring or trying to get their child into an extracurricular, what should they do?
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating question, right? Because in the process, so this is a book about fairness. But in the process, like I learned a lot of good tricks that like in some ways make the system less fair. And so, certainly getting a tutor to boost your SAT and your ACT score, it works. Getting your kid enrolled in the kind of sports that kids play in prep school, squash and tennis and golf, that works. Going through all of the sort of advantages that rich kids tend to have, all of those things seem to pay off when it comes time for college admissions. Now, at the same time, there's the reality that they're not fair, right? And so I think if you're a parent with some financial resources, you have this sort of twin question that you have to ask at the same time, which is, how do I help my kid succeed in a system that is already somewhat unfair? And I think it's a tough question, and I know I'm going to be wrestling with it in 6 or 7 years when my older son gets to this point. But I do think that thinking about it the way we are encouraged to think about it, as this winner-take-all competitive system where our job is just to beat the other kids and get into the most exclusive institution we can, that is just toxic kind of thinking, and it's toxic not only for us and for our kids, but for our nation. And so I do think that there's a way to help your kids, help them find the path that's right for them, but also try to dial down the intensity of the competitive pressure that has been put on us and that we then continue to put on our kids in terms of higher education admissions.
On a personal level, then what message would you have for a student or a parent who has it locked in their head that there is one right school for the kid to go to, and if they don't get into that school, oh boy, the world's going to end. Yeah, and their life is over, and they're never going to be a success, and they're never going to be happy. And because I know a lot of people harbor those kinds of ideas, in the back of their mind, that if I don't get into Harvard or whatever it might be, whatever your top choice school would be.
Well, I think what's important for parents in that situation, and I certainly have met those parents as well, the main message is chill out for those parents. and I think the slightly deeper message is think carefully about who you care about in that equation. Is it really a question of how much you care about your kid and where they go and what opportunities they're going to have, and how much is it that you care about yourself and your standing in your community and what you're able to brag about to your friends? And some of that is totally natural, but it's important, I think, for us as parents to recognize when we're doing that. We all do it to a certain extent, but in something as important as college admissions, if we're driving our kid crazy to get them into a college that we care a lot more about than they do, that is not helping them. It's not helping us. It's not helping anybody.
Mm-hmm. And Paul, with all of your years in education journalism, like we mentioned, you must have a great nobody told me lesson for us. We always ask our guests, what is your nobody told me lesson? So what is it that nobody told you about this college admissions process that you wish they had when you first started researching this book 6 years ago?
Well, the very specific one that nobody told me is how flexible financial aid is. So I had always thought that financial aid was something that was really given out, based on need alone. And it has really changed. So there's a whole chapter in my book about enrollment management and this crazy thing called financial aid optimization. And it has become this amazingly complex system where schools give out enough, only enough aid to get you to show up. And parents and kids have a lot more leverage in the system than I think that they do. The way the system works is not necessarily good for colleges or for equity in general, but for individual parents, the fact that they now have so much leverage in this process is something that nobody told me.
And what advice would you have for taking on a tremendous amount of student debt?
I would say be careful. I mean, I think that college education is a good investment, right? So it like spending a chunk of money on a great 4-year degree is not necessarily a bad idea. But I think we tend to invest it with this sort of magical thinking that because a college degree is a good thing, it must be true that spending any amount of money on a college degree is also a good thing. And in fact, it's an investment like anything else. And so for instance, if there is a choice between 2 years at a basically free community college and then 2 years at a great 4-year institution versus 4 years at that that institution, maybe it's a better deal to go to only go 2 years if that's going to make a big difference. If you got to think about your family's economics, you got to think about the career that you want. If you want to, go into social work or being an elementary school teacher or something that doesn't pay a ton, you should be thinking really carefully about how much money you're spending on your college degree. And I think we're not encouraged to think about it as a sort of normal kind of investment where you look for savings like anything else. And the reality is that it should be.
And how can people connect with you on social media and the internet and also learn about the new book?
Well, the new book's called The Years That Matter Most. It's at bookstores everywhere. My website is paultough.com. That's TOUGH, and then I'm on Twitter at paultough as well, so they can track me down any number of ways. I'm going to be on tour all this fall, speaking about the book in lots of different cities. So if your listeners go to my website, they can find out where I'll be, and I'd love it if they would come out and say hi.
Oh, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Paul.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, we learned an awful lot from it.
Thanks.
And I'm glad I'm not doing that college admissions process. That was one thing I learned.
I'm glad you're not. I'm glad that part of our lives is over. Our thanks to our guest, Paul Tough. Again, his latest book is called The Years That Matter Most, How College Makes or Breaks Us. And again, his website is paultough.com.
I'm Laura Owens.
And I'm Jan Black.
And you've been listening to Nobody Told Me. Thank you so much for joining us.